think so. It's so good to see your face.
Yay, same. Yeah. You
But
definitely have a glow. And I'm like, yes, this is like, I want to be connecting with my people.
I know. Well, I really want to thank you for agreeing to be part of Quarantined Historians. It's actually maybe or maybe not drinking coffee. I'm not drinking coffee right now. I'm drinking tea.
I have this wonderful tea goddess ghee cinnamon drink that I'm having.
Oh, that
Yeah.
sounds good. I just
Hmm.
have an English breakfast.
That's fine.
But
You were
they
like, I
put
didn't.
it in this mug specifically for you. It says, create your own sunshine. And it just made me
That
think
mug.
of you what?
I love that what it says. Also, this is my mug. It says Forest Defenders.
I love it.
It's
Yes,
like
I
we're
knew you would
Justice
love
League.
this mug.
Yeah, I do. It's like, yes, we're defending nature and we're also creating the things.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
this is the moment we're having.
I do look at my mugs and try and think about the person I'm going to be talking to and match the mug with the person.
I love it. You're so intentional.
You immediately came to mind when we started talking about this series. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then a little bit about the adéPROJECT and that mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me and thinking of me for this amazing series. I feel like COVID-19 definitely has created the opportunity for us to be responsive to what's happening in community and to be adaptable and flexible in maybe ways that we haven't been before. Um, so I'm excited to be here. Again, my name is Cortina Jenelle Caldwell. I'm the founder, creative community organizer for Artist Designing Evolution, also known as adéPROJECT. And I come from generations and a long line of Southern West African Indigenous farmers and artists and entrepreneurs and creatives. And I like to honor that because I think that for me as an artist, not only is my like artist hat one of the like last hats that I accepted in my life to wear with honor and authenticity, but I think it's also important for me to, in order to step into my role, both in my own life and in community as an artist, I also had to understand that it was important for me to also be a historian. I know a lot of the artists that I get a chance to work with and build with, we're often checking facts and researching and looking for the truth. And so that's really the foundation that adéPROJECT was created on. And I would say, the mission itself is to actualize equity, spark creative inquiry, and reclaim the narrative with a specific focus on really exploring the cultural roots around the African diaspora and the untold narratives that have really shaped our culture and our identities. And then also doing some what I like to call radical imagining. And what that looks like for us in our work is that we're working with artists and organizers and students and educators and entrepreneurs that come together to work cooperatively. And we work on projects, programs, and initiatives that leverage resources for the community. And we're seeking to do that with art as our response, is our manifesto. And so we focus and zoom in on 5 key areas of how we work alongside and with the community, which are creative facilitation, entrepreneurship, service, storytelling, and training and education. And those are our strategic responses to the community challenges and barriers that have faced communities of color for generations. And so really the work is about leveraging our own capacities to create and reimagine what's possible in the world around us. But also, it's very rooted in this principle and this belief that those who are most impacted by disparity are the ones with the wisdom and the knowledge to shift it. Because we're people that have lived experience of living in a world that has not welcomed us. in many ways. And so, in order for us to contribute to society, we really have to not only know who we are, but we have to create community around lifting up the solutions that are going to work for the better to just make an inclusive um, world for all people. And so, this is an unmet need, and I feel like this has been a lifetime of preparation to found this cooperative, and in its form that it is today was created in September of 2018, so not super long, but a lot of us have already have worked together for years, and so that's a really beautiful part of it too, is that our work has culminated into this. And yeah, we get to really dig into history and to doing meaningful equity and inclusion, racial equity and gender equity, um, and inclusion work uh, from a creative lens. So it's a lot of fun in that way because we get to bring people together and have conversations in a different way.
One of the things that you mentioned was like being involved in the the narrative, being involved in it is a way to shift it. Talked about a lot of, in the field of public history has been called difficult history. And, a lot of us have, public historians have been trying to transition that term and call it necessary history, because it's not really difficult history. What's difficult is how people react to it.
Yeah.
Um, and so it got me thinking
And
about.
I also want to touch on something that you named around difficult history, because I had a very visceral body response to that. And in the time that we're in right now, being quarantined and what's being called, social distancing, which for me, I'm really adopting very intentional language around it. And it's not that we're social distancing, we're in social solidarity because we're
Mm,
still needing that social connection. And we're still needing to be part of and connected to society. But we are physically distant. Um, and that goes back to something that I think is really at the premise of everything, which is that as human beings, we all want a sense of belonging. We all want to feel connected with ourselves and the world around us. And unfortunately, we haven't necessarily been given the tools by the world around us in order to navigate difference. And instead of creating belonging, what often has happened and what we're seeing the consequences of today is this notion of othering. And othering has been how some populations have moved forward. It's how we have a white supremacist culture, because this notion of, in order to have power or privilege or control, you have to be better than the other. And so we've created this very deep psychological pathway of wanting to group things in category and to really make decisions based on difference.
mhm,
And so it's really, for me, it's like, it's spiritual, it's intellectual, it's racial, like it hits on all these levels.
mhm,
um, with the Vance Historic Site, I think that one of the reasons why people are hesitant or refusing to be connected to it is because it brings up this visceral experience and representation of what othering has caused and has looked like in our society. And I think that it's a very divisive conversation in our community, because, we have streets and a monument and uh, other places that have the Vance name in it. And I think historically, we do see how, in the simplest way, like it's the story and legacy of
mhm,
othering African Americans and their descendants, also indigenous folk and the land
mhm,
keepers that were here before anybody else. And so there is this legacy of trauma that can still be felt, because I think that it's so overwhelming and it feels so insurmountable to have this conversation about the duality of a person's life and a person's
mhm,
legacy. And while Vance, in his mind and his family, may have been just seeking to create a sense of belonging for him and his family and the society at that time, it was done at the expense of others. Which again goes back to why do people feel this way, and why is it
Mm-hmm.
there this divide. So, I think for me, as somebody whose life work is equity and inclusion and justice, but I also, from my childhood, like being born and raised in Morganton, North Carolina, which is Burke County, and just an hour from Asheville, where I've called my home since 2011. Um, I mean, my family, for me, it's my family roots are here.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole different level of possibility, I think, for me when I step into spaces and I know what my role is, because it feels like to me I'm doing the work that my ancestors and the elders um, have paved the way for not only me but for all of us to do, because I think that our greatest work is really creating this sense of belonging for everybody, and that we don't need to get ahead or have advantage at the expense of another person that's inhumane. And I think that the weight of that inhumanity is what keeps people from wanting to connect with the Vance Historic Site.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like that's where some of our conversations started was, again, like art being a universal language
Mm-hmm.
and a gatherer of people, and a really powerful medium for reflecting where society is at or has been. I think that we have a lot of possibility that can happen with doing a public art project, or a youth education project, or whatever form it ends up taking, um, because I have the discernment to be able to understand it from a very understand um, the legacy and the imprint of the site and of the Vance family from a couple of sides. I'm not saying that I agree, but from that place of othering and belonging, I can dissect it and understand it.
Yeah.
And so I really think that it's about um, having a conversation, and acknowledging that it wasn't as if there was no harm done.
Right.
And so I think that as we move to a society too that's more empathetic and compassionate, and we learn how to really confront our grief, that we can start to unravel um, white fragility around topics of race and justice, and have difficult conversations. A white supremacist culture is that it perpetuates this sense of inhumanity, and this sense of, if we're getting ahead and if we're moving forward in a way that's done at the expense of somebody else, that doesn't matter. If we're moving ahead at the expense of our planet, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
If we're, producing things at the expense of other ecosystems or other countries, um, vitality, that doesn't matter. And so I think what we are saying and seeing is like, no, those things do matter. And I think the point of really doing racial equity work or racial justice work and telling these stories and having these hard conversations from a white person's perspective is we're just asking for you to connect with your humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that might feel scary and a big ask for people who have been, really asked to disengage from their humanity in order to get ahead as a people, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what was required, was to turn the other cheek and to look the other way, as there were lynchings happening, as people were being enslaved and treated unfairly just on the basis of race, and ethnicity. And so I think that white fragility is an important teacher, just like grief, just like anger, just like sadness,
Mm-hmm.
of we really have to pay attention where it actually hurts and not be afraid of that pain, but really like be with it and acknowledge that it is hurtful. It is painful that we allowed this to happen to our brothers and sisters, or, that we participated in it by not saying anything and staying silent. It is painful. And in order for us to move forward, we have to work from that place of grief and pain and sadness and like avoidance. We have to move through that. because I don't think avoidance is going to create the resolution. So I feel like in that way, again, with adéPROJECT, we have this really unique positioning to engage folks through art projects and really be able to, I would say, art creative reimagining, right? Because it's not always about using art for the, like the way people think about it. I feel like a lot of people think about painting when they
Mm-hmm.
think about art, but it's also like there's art to how we facilitate. There's an art to, you know, how we're hosting events and gatherings and things like this too. So, um, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, and this is the last thing I'll say before I pause because I've been connecting all the things together at
You
once.
have that.
Um, yeah, but in terms of my experience being there, like with all these perspectives and layers going on for me, and then also like, you know, recognizing that there had been people who had visited before the site before and who were people of color, and there have been folks that have refused to go. And so part of me was like, are you sure you wanna, like, what exactly are you saying yes to if, you know, this has been true for everybody else? So,
Yeah, I
but
tried to prepare you a little
yeah,
bit as
I
best I
know. Yeah,
could. I
I
don't.
know. Yeah, and you did a great job too, because I mean, at the end of the day, I just had to make the decision for myself. And, you know, I think it was also great because, you know, you and I had connected prior in like a mutual space and then had a couple of great conversations before me coming. So, I mean, to me, it felt like enough, you know. And so, you know, I come visit, and there were definitely when I first pulled onto the property, like as a spiritual person and a very like intuitive person with the connection to like land and especially these lands, I definitely felt the weight of a story on the land when I first pulled up. And so I was like, huh, this is interesting to kind of feel that things feel a little heavy, like the air feels a little thicker. Um, and so, you know, parked the car and walked inside and was greeted by you and Lauren. And then Lauren took me off on the tour, which was amazing and informative. And, you know, just in a nutshell or in short, I'll say there are definitely several moments where it felt like there was, you know, I'm not going to necessarily say that there were ghosts, but I am going to say like there definitely felt like an energy. And again, it's kind of like the best way I can describe it is like the weight of a story. Like you can almost feel the other timelines because everything is so like preserved in some way. You know,
Mhm.
it's like these were the actual plates and examples of spices, and you know, this was the bed and the fireplace, and you know, these were all of the things, and even to the dwelling that the enslaved people lived in.
Mhm.
And there was definitely a moment where I made some connections in my head of like really wanting to dig deeper into the history of Vance and like really being drawn by the fact that there was china in the Vance house, because I'm like, how in the world in the 1800s, you know, or, you know, that time period where people knew about China? Like that was the first question that came to my head. I was like, people knew about China? And I think it's just this like question of like, you know, I never liked history in school because I always felt like I was being lied to. And so there was this part of me that was like, damn, I don't think they taught us that in history school, that like in the Appalachians, people knew about China and were like talking to China to trade plates and dishes, you know? So it was like this really like childlike moment where I was like, that is really random and interesting to me. And so then like I went down this whole rabbit hole in my mind and ended up asking you know, Lauren the question out loud about the china, and she was like, why are you asking me about like I could see that like, even though she didn't say it, she was so great about answering the question, but then I could kind of see on her face like, really, the china? Like, which was great. And
He's
so
like, we just talked about all this heavy stuff, and you're like, tell me about this China pattern over here.
yeah. And but then that led me to this other place when we went in the kitchen. because that was like kind of in like the family room.
Mm-hmm.
And then I noticed the spices, and we were talking about, I think it was ginkgo. Um, it's an herb
Was
that
it
people,
ginseng?
ginseng, thank you. And it was a G. Um, and how people associate that with coming from China or like
Mm-hmm.
from Asian
Right.
countries. And Lauren shared an interesting tidbit that actually it had the plant itself is native to the Appalachians. And, again, back in that time, the plants were used as something that were traded, and I think in some ways kind of given to China. And then I think as things progress, of course it started, they planted it and were growing it in China. And now the association that people have is that, oh, this medicine or plant comes from China. And so again, I go back to like these untold narratives and these half truths, and how they can be really revealing, because then it's like, wow, I like somebody could really dig deeply into what was the relationship between the Appalachians and China, and how did that shape culture at that time, or even
Mm-hmm.
what we know it to be today.
Mm-hmm.
And then she shared the book that she had gotten it from, which was, I think, is it
Mountain Masters.
Mountain Masters, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and yeah, there was definitely this point where I felt like, again, energy present, and just really felt called to dig a little bit more deeper into plants, or into the plants of the region.
Mm-hmm.
And like, yeah, just like felt this, yeah, like I felt this tap on my elbow. I just have to say, like, it definitely felt like this, like strong, like pin sensation. And again, like I believe in body wisdom, and even if it wasn't an entity outside of me, like our bodies are tuning forks. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was like, I need to pay attention to what's coming up right now. Um, and so of course I ended up getting the book from the gift shop out the door.
That's what we
And
do.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly, because we're historians, right? And we
Right.
have to know, like, once you get a piece of the story, like, you got to keep digging.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that that's what makes any great historian, is like, you don't just take the story at face value. You need to know the other stories that are connected to it. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was definitely a moment for me. And then we're currently on this other thread of that, which is to see if this person that was in the book is connected to my like lineage of people, based on like my family's last name, and like some of the other areas that my family and relatives are from, showing up in the book with the same last name.
Mm-hmm.
um, so that's been really interesting. So yeah, all of that. And I think it's really, I mean, I get why people want to avoid the topic and don't want to talk about it, because I don't. And again, I have to say, it goes back to those in leadership, and really the decision that's being made by those who are kind of the gatekeepers,
Mm-hmm.
um, or, the information holders, if you will. And at this conference I went to last year, called the Black Communities Conference in Durham, there were several conversations from folks from around different university library systems, and just really having this conversation around equity and inclusion from library and research archives, and
Mm-hmm.
how little has been archived about the stories, and the contributions from communities of color and LGBTQ communities. And like how folks are having a conversation to really understand that was like, they had that power to choose what got archived and what got saved, and there were decisions that were made to only save certain kinds of information. And so now there are gaps that we're, I
Mm-hmm.
think,
Yeah.
as a community, trying to dig back into.
It's going to take um, white people being confronting that what has been happening for so long, to create this white supremacist culture, and push back on those feelings, because I think what ends up happening is people actually feel guilty, but instead of recognizing that guilt, they're reacting in anger.
Yeah.
And this means we need to recognize that there are so many different narratives. And I think, especially with like the archives and the libraries, the hard part is that they have been dominated, run predominantly by white people. And I think it is it's a change of thinking, because I think has been made natural for at least white people to think about it from the white perspective, right?
Mhm.
So naturally they're going to, like, unless you push yourself to think differently, you're
Mhm.
naturally going to gravitate towards, the storylines that relate to your life.
Mhm.
And
And
so I
that's
think,
what we call implicit bias, which
right,
is important to name. Yeah.
yeah, so I don't think it's something that is just you flip a switch and it just changes. Like, even for me, I know you and I have talked about it in one of our previous conversations, where it's a continuous process. How many of the artifacts in the house are original to the Vances? And I said, like 3 or 4 pieces. And he was like, but you make a story for the Vances every day. And to be honest, I started thinking about it and I thought, yes, I don't have the words from Venus. Like, I don't have what Venus would actually say, but I do have the estate sale from the 1840s when Venus goes up on the auction block and is sold for $1, or bought back by the family, by Myra Baird, for $1. I have that document. I know that it happened. And so I can still, as like a public historian, I can still interpret that. I can still tell that narrative, and I can still spark conversation and thought around that, and
Mhm.
and encourage people to think about it from the perspective of Venus. Encouraging white people to look at that differently. I think is one of the things that comes to mind when you're talking about people coming to the site and those interactions and the things that are happening, and just the lack of content that has been collected. I do think it is that bias, and it's not. I think it's going to take um, the people who have been at the top allowing it to happen to
Mhm.
confront, just as more so, honestly, than anything else, to get it to change.
People often like talk about how racial equity work and inclusion work is optional for white folks, because if you're already in the position of the majority and you have the privilege and you're not necessarily been being impacted um, in disparaging ways by um, the supremacist systems that have been set up, then if it's when it gets uncomfortable, or when that moment of white fragility does come up, there's always going to be the option to choose to not look at it, to not see it,
Mhm.
to like want to avoid it, to stay away from the thing that reminded you that we live in a racist, supremacist, misogynist, patriarchal society. um, and I think it, it's also important to name that nobody wins, right? Like, yes, it's true that it's optional. And I've heard that narrative from folks like, yeah, it's optional for white people to choose whether or not they care about this. They don't have to do racial equity work, but we as people of color have to, because we're in it every day. And for me, my response to that is like, yeah, but nobody's winning. Like, at the end of the day, I don't necessarily know if I would want to be put in a position to where, I mean, I'm just going to be like very direct and just say the words that are coming, but for the cost of my soul
Mm,
and my connection to humanity, to have access to more material
mm,
possessions and advantages and opportunities, I don't think that's what I would want to have to choose.
right.
And I feel like that's actually what a white supremacist culture is choosing on behalf of the white people participating every day. And so the real question comes down to, are you ready to make your own decisions? And also to take this opportunity to really see how inhumane that sort of treatment and behavior is, and just be willing to see that there are other humans that are being impacted in ways that you wouldn't want to be impacted by. And
Mhm.
so choosing to not participate means that it shifts for everybody, because, you know, there are policies and laws and bills that have been passed to keep people of color and women in lesser positions that at the end of the day impacts all of society. You know, like
Mhm.
it's not going to just touch those people. Like there are still, like there are white poor folks and rural, you know, low income earners and, you know, folks that don't have access to opportunities or privileges that aren't necessarily, I mean, according to their race, they should have all these privileges, right? But they're
Mhm.
still not, the way that the system is set up, like based on class and race, like you're still not really gaining in the ways that we have this like elusive thought that we are. So I
Mhm.
feel like it's important to also hold that truth as like, you know, yes, I feel, I understand the frustration that like it could be optional for white folks, but I feel like, you know, it's, people have to make the shift when they're ready. And if
Mhm.
somebody is choosing to, you know, turn the other cheek or look the other way, that means to me they're not ready. But that's not true for all white people. And when I talk about white supremacy and like white fragility, I'm not, you know, pointing my finger at or like belittling white people. But
Right.
what I am talking about is whiteness. And I think
Mhm.
we're all impacted by and, you know, have all contributed to whiteness because it's just this notion that, you know, white is the superior race
Mhm.
and the standard. And so that's going to eliminate and erase everybody else and their cultures and their traditions in order to meet this standard in society. So I
Mhm.
just wanted to also make that point clear too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Getting back to the art side of everything, you had talked about art being more than, you know, like the painting, and you were
Mhm.
talking about the other ways, you know, of art, and it got me thinking about another conversation we had around the project that we've been, the educational program we've been kind of mulling over and working on. I won't get into the details of the project. More just one of the questions you asked me was, you know, how could the site create um, a safe space, almost like an emotionally safe space for the kids.
Mhm.
And that's something, honestly, that I have really been thinking a lot about since, and not just in that particular education program, but for our visitors in general. You know, like how can we, as staff, do a better job of creating this emotionally safe space? And if and the art of that, you know, other than just stepping back. Sometimes I think poor guides talk too much,
Mhm.
talk
Yeah.
too fast, and it's like they're uncomfortable, so they're just like throwing as much information out as they can, and they just keep talking. It's like almost being quiet, letting people reflect. But you know, I'm interested to know if you've thought any more about that. Or
Listening with the intent of transformation. I think that communities of color have been surveyed and asked their opinion and have, you know, been part of conversations and meetings and things like that for a long time. And I think that people get tired of talking and not being heard. So I also think that, you know, if the inquiry is going to happen, like already having your next 2, 3 steps identified of how you're going to apply and integrate what you hear, and that
mm,
it's not just you showing up with a savior complex and like wanting to create this connection to a space that's going to open up a lot for people and not be ready for what happens after the visitation. Um, and so that's where my mind goes, is like, sure, I think the goal of any art gallery or museum or historical site is for visitation, but I honestly would make the point and argue that it should actually be relationship,
mm,
and that it should extend beyond somebody showing up at your space, that they should be in relationship with you in that space and that story after. And so I think approaching it that way allows you to really forge partnerships with school partners or community partners or even student groups
mhm,
that can be reflective and informative and probably really powerful both ways, because you can from that space have focus groups and have conversations that are targeted about, how the space and the site and, all the resources that come along with it can really align with community. And I think that's one of the reasons why even before COVID-19, a lot of historical sites and um, museums, continue to struggle with visitation numbers and
Mhm.
are constantly trying to find other ways to get people in their doors.
So even
Um,
some of the more harder conversations of how can I follow up with people and like actually see how they're doing afterwards and engage with them a bit. So
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that will definitely shift because we need we need people to be in relationship with these historic sites. We need people to be curious about these stories because there is this divide between what's considered history and what's relevant to now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a really critical space that historic sites and museums and even art galleries, depending on how, like what their niche is,
Mm-hmm.
um, really serve in our community. And who knows what'll come out of this? I mean, you're having conversations with folks, and I mean, in this way, it's like, yeah, this isn't physically happening at the Vance Historic Site, but it is building relationship with you and with the site, and um, yeah, getting creative, which is what it's about. I definitely would love to come back. I feel like there's so many conversations that we could have. We just kind of got to touch on some things now, but I think the thing that I would want to say or like leave people with is like, we have to continue having conversations and continuing to be curious and be willing to be creative, even when it feels silly or
Mm-hmm.
not worth it. But that is how we can have a more inclusive society, is not just having decisions that are being made for us, but like actively participating and shaping the world around us. And that's what it's about for adéPROJECT. I would also just share and offer that we do have a Conquering COVID-19 page up that I added to our website
Okay.
that has our list of weekly resources that get emailed, as well as how we're showing up and how we can be called on during this time that calls for more creativity and community led solutions. So, we're shifting to make ourselves available for what's needed. And I personally am going to be doing a lot of trainings, and some of those being about facilitating and holding spaces online. And, um, a lot of what we're focused on right now is just making sure that we can be called on as a resource as things continue, because what's required is for us to get creative. And so,
Mm-hmm.
really just showing up for that. um, Also, there's a calendar of virtual programming. So we're right now hosting uh, online creative sessions for youth throughout the week during the day, as a way for them to get to participate in facilitated art activities with our artist members.
Great.
And that roster will grow. And then a lot of our programs that we would have been doing in the community are shifting online. So, for example, we have a Stand Against Racism Earth Day event that would have been at the Mothlight in Asheville next
Okay.
weekend. But instead of that, we're now going to be hosting it on Zoom and opening it to the public. So that's really how we're moving, and all those updates you can track on our webpage, which is theadéproject.org. And then across the top, you'll see a link for Conquering COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the other thing I would say is if folks want to support and they're not sure how they can show up right now and they don't necessarily have financial resources to support community, that we're willing to, also just connect people with donations of time. Like if you just want to volunteer to do some like admin work or like phone banking or whatever's needed to
Mm-hmm.
help efforts. And then in-kind resources. So we're also going to be doing herbal kits and self-care kits and art kits, and mailing those out to our community members. because we also recognize, especially with the communities that we work with, that people don't often have things just accessible at home. Like some needs were getting met by being out in community spaces.
Hmm.
So that's a way that we can show up right now.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah, those are the things that we're up to.
The like supplies and things like that, if someone wants to do like a in-kind donation of, say, like the art supplies for the kits and things like that that y'all are making, is that on your webpage, like a list of supplies?
We're willing to accept, any supplies because we can get creative with how they get
Yeah.
used and packaged. So I would say whatever is feeling like they want to share. There
Okay.
is a request form for community support on the website.
Oh, okay, great.
I would just say there isn't a place to be like, I have some things to donate, but they can email me directly.
Okay.
And that can just be connect at the adéPROJECT.org. And then we would arrange getting those, and are grateful
Awesome.
for anything that people want to donate. But it's a great, easy way for people to, because everybody feels like they want to show up and support all the various needs that are going on right now. And
Right.
yeah, so this is a way that we're feeling good and clear about that most people can do.
Nice. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's great.
Yeah.
I want to thank you again for, you know, taking the time just to talk with me a little bit about art and the project, and some of our interactions and what we've been doing.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm grateful to you for just modeling exactly the thing, the responsiveness and connecting with community and just really being willing to lead differently. So thank you for that. And I look forward to whatever we cook up next.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Thank
All right, have a
you.
good one. Bye.
Bye.